We're here tonight to talk about Tantra.
Tantra.
It's a big subject. So we want to begin with the idea that Tantra is a choice that we're making in each moment. Many of you probably know that the word Tantra means weaving in Sanskrit. And so there's this idea of bringing threads together and warp and weft. And part of the choice is that we, as weavers, we can choose what we weave. We can choose colors, we can choose materials, we can choose thickness, we can choose fineness. We have a lot of choices involved with what we weave and how we weave, what it looks like, what it feels like. And this applies to our lives as well.
The Tantra, the word also has tra in it. Tantra, and the tra part in English becomes trowel, as in you use it to spread cement and stuff, right? So it's a working tool. So one of the ideas in Tantra is that it's a working tool. It's a way of working with consciousness to create and build something. So when we talk about Tantra, we're talking about a choice. So Tantra is very much a choice. And we often think sometimes that we don't have a lot of choice. We just sort of end up in the states we end up by accident. No? And how did I get into this state, or how did I get into this place? It was kind of an accident, kind of came across me.
How did my life turn out this way?
How did I get here? So the idea with Tantra is really introducing also the idea of will. It's a decision. So we're going to suggest that the states that you have arising during the day you don't actually choose. That when you get up in the morning you're in a good mood, or you go to bed at night you're in a bad mood. It's just kind of they sort of come out of nowhere, and that you don't have any decision in the process. And what we're going to suggest is, well, let's say you had two choices. Let's say
by way of example.
By way of example. So let's say you had the choice between fantastically wonderful, and if I'm shouting in the front row, it's to try and get the people in the back row. Let's say you had a choice between fantastically wonderful and fucking miserable. Which would you choose?
Wonderful.
Yeah, fantastically. It's a no-brainer. You're going to choose fantastically wonderful. And what we're arguing is that with Tantra, you're learning to make the decision to choose fantastically wonderful, compared to the opposite, which is maybe terribly miserable, right? And we don't usually think that we have a choice necessarily in the states, because the states that arise we take as being real because they're arising.
Or sort of like weather, something that we just muddle through until it passes.
So the nature of choosing your states, often people go, well, that's not real. The state that's arising now is real. But we're arguing...
Or it's honest.
Or it's honest. And we're arguing that the state that's arising isn't chosen. It's a habitual reaction to familiar conditions. That the newspapers or the TV or your neighbors or the people you work with or the current economic situation or England's decisions...
Or the families we grew up with.
Or the families you grew up with.
Or the families we've chosen.
Are kind of making that decision for us. And we're arguing that with Tantra, you can make a decision to be fantastically wonderful 100% of the time. How much percentage of the time? 100% of the time. You can choose the state you're in. But because our consciousness runs on habitual energies, we tend to default to whatever kicks up in the moment.
So we all know that our mind states or our heart states are deeply connected to chemicals in the body: oxytocin, cortisol, dopamine, these kinds of things, and these are some of the patterns, the shapings that we're talking about. Those chemicals that arise are also arising based on our early family environment, the company we choose to keep, the activities that we choose to do. And so those are part of our warp and weft that we're choosing to weave. Even if we're not all that aware of the choice, it's often a habitual choice. And what Doug Sensei is referring to is learning to choose, make these choices with more awareness, and to change the choices to something that we prefer and that's better for our health.
So in Buddhism, we have a statement that says Chaitana is karma. And karma, as you know, means action. It also means force or power. And Chaitana, the Sanskrit word, means will or decision. So what you choose is your karma. And insofar as you don't make a choice, then the default karma is the karma you've been handed with or given to by your conditioning. So if you want to make
otherwise known as our habits.
Or habits. So if you want to make a different decision, if you want to change karma, you need to change decisions. And to change decisions, you have to come out of habit. And as we all know, habits are hard to change, right? They take willpower, right? So changing your habitual patterns, which produce your habitual states, requires willpower. The willpower that you need to change the state, to change the karma, is in your hands. You can do it. But if you don't do anything, right, what's going to happen? Same old, same old. And so this is the difficulty with our daily lives. Our daily lives are so fraught, are so filled with habitual decisions and habitual actions, we don't think we have the room or the elbow room to make different decisions.
And this goes on every level. There's the personal habits, there's the familial habits, there's the kind of tribal or racial habits, and then there's the society-wide habits. Mm-hmm. So we like to call CNN, well, like might not be the right word. CNN is, we call the Crisis News Network. Mm-hmm. So if we want to know about all the crises that are going on in the world, that's what we'll tune into. And I'm quite sure that there are many, many good stories that could also be being played, right? So I'm not advocating ignorance of world events, but we're very choiceful with how much of a dose we're gonna take of that kind of information.
A lot of people at the end of their day are tired. They say you have X amount of energy for decision making. So if you're getting up in the morning and you're choosing what kind of coffee you're going to have, and then you're going to choose what kind of bun or croissant or how you're going to have your eggs, that by 5 o'clock in the afternoon you're out of energy. You're out of decision energy because you kind of used it all making, like you go to a drugstore or a stationery store to choose a pen and you got 800 pens to choose from. By the time you've chosen your toilet paper and your pens, you're worn out. So when it comes to what you do in the evening, most people want to just zone out or turn off or take a break, watch TV or something. But that's still a decision that's feeding your consciousness in terms of what's going in, what you're watching, what you're following. So the understanding is that if you don't do anything, your conscious is going to default to the pre-written program that we call habit. Now, the reason most people are happiest at work is because when they're working, they're focused on a decision that isn't a habitual consciousness that feeds their regular choices. But the minute they get away from work, right, they go back to decisions and choices that feed their habitual natures of their conditioning. And so the state tends to stay the same, regardless of how many self-help programs or interesting lectures or talks we hear, because it doesn't get carried out of the building in the next 15 minutes when you walk down the road. Nature of the distractions and the noise and the consumerism, it grabs your attention. So as you walk down the street, your attention's being grabbed by everything.
Oh yeah.
There's no room there for a decision, to make a different decision that can change the consciousness from just consumption or habitual to an altered way of looking. So Tantra's come along and said, well, it's really hard to change habit by doing nothing. That's kind of the Zen approach. You kind of do nothing, or the Mahamudra approach if you're into the Vajrayana.
As a practice, you mean, do nothing as a practice, right?
So,
even in Zen today, if you go to the monastery, no books allowed. There's I think a single prayer book that everyone will have, but you don't take books in with you, and it's to show us what's happening in our minds. That's the practice.
So there needs to be a middle ground. The middle ground between being able to empty your mind, Zenish way, right, and the regular day-to-day activity that consumes your mind with, for lack of a better word, trivia. And so Tantra came along and introduced a technology or a methodology to give you a substitute. The methadone for consumption is Tantra, right? So if you use a tantric image or a tantric archetype, a tantric ideal, and you put your mind on that, then you're slowly conditioning your consciousness to choose something other than the habitual. So there are in the Tibetan system, there are, well, it's not strictly Tibetan, Vajrayana, the Himalayan system, and the Hindus have it as well. You have tantric deities or tantric archetypes. And the purpose of the archetype is to put your mind on what you would like to have your mind on. To put your mind on something that enriches you or grows you or develops you in some way. And by putting your mind on that and repeating it over and over and over again, you undermine the habitual nature of the negative states, or the not so wholesome states, or the merely consumptive states of day-to-day living.
So one example, probably you may be familiar with Medicine Buddha. Medicine Buddha would be one of these archetypes. We like to call them archetypes. Sometimes they're called deities, but they're not exactly deities in the sense that there's something else that we worship or pray to. It's more about an energy that we are learning to incorporate, learning to resonate with through the practice. And we start by considering it as an image externally, and then through the practice we learn to incorporate it as an energy within us, or everywhere really, not just within us. So one time I had caught a flu or something, and I was laying in bed just feeling miserable, how you do when you have a flu. And I'm just kind of really experiencing this misery. I'm just like, wow, when you're sick, you really feel bad. And I'm kind of getting into just how bad I feel, right, and where it feels bad. And then, and then I think, gosh, instead of thinking about the nature of how bad I feel, I could be thinking about Medicine Buddha. I think that's really quite a better idea. So I started visualizing Medicine Buddha and imagining in my mind saying the Medicine Buddha mantra, and it was like night and day. And I felt quite silly. I'd been practicing for a few decades, and I had to suffer through at least an hour of misery before it dawned on me to try this practice I'd done quite a lot of. That's the nature of being human, and that's the nature of these patterns as well. They're deep, and it's why when we see how challenging it is to change these patterns in ourselves, it helps us to develop compassion for one another, because we're all in this together.
And that's the power of habit. In Catherine's story, her habit just defaults to feeling miserable. She has to exercise her will to make a decision to do something else, and in that process it feels artificial, which is why a lot of people have trouble with tantric practices, is they seem or feel artificial because they're contra habit. They're out of the box. They're away from what we're used to.
And they're also, for most of us, they're kind of foreign. Medicine Buddha is this blue human being, right? Not really in my background.
Unless you alien movie. So the tantric deities of the future may look like aliens. We may just substitute all those Asian tantric deities for alien movie creatures and accomplish the same purpose. But the important thing to remember about Tantra is it works because of two reasons. One is your aspiration to be in a different state. And two, your willingness to apply the energy onto it that produces the actual state that you're contemplating. So it's very weird that if you meditate on compassion, like in, for instance, Chenrezig in Tibet, Kannon in Japan, and Kuan Yin in China, all the same creature. If you meditate on compassion and you use the mantra and the visualization of saying, I'm doing compassion, I'm doing compassion, I'm doing compassion, the visual image is to give you something to relate to. It looks human. And the mantra is to occupy your dialogue mind, your dialectic mind, the yappy mind. You know that yappy mind that goes on all day long? Right? So your visual field is occupied, your mental field is occupied, and your verbal field is occupied, and that's what you're doing. And curiously enough, the reason it works is because if I spend my entire day thinking about compassion or meditating on compassion, how do you think I might behave? Quite nicely, right? You're going to act more compassionately, and that's the nature of the beast. If you're kind of nervous and upset and your energy's off and somebody rides their bike over your toe on the way to work in the morning, your initial reaction is going to reflect the state you're in. If you're kind of meditating and reflecting on compassion or loving kindness, and you're doing that practice and somebody rides their bike over your toe in the morning, it's still going to hurt and you're still going to have a tendency to react in the same way, but the underlying change of the pattern will give you a different option. Like, could you please watch where you're going, or something like that. Kind of a more moderated adjustment to this event.
We lived in Japan for a long time. We met some of these fine people in Japan, and they have a saying in Japanese: if you're dipped in red ink, you come out red. And so this is what Sensei is referring to. If we dip ourselves in the compassion practice, we'll come out compassionate. And that's back to our weaving. If we dip our weaving in compassion, we'll have a more compassionate life. That's what the practice is about. And then we get to choose these patterns, right? It may be compassion, it may be healing, it may be nurturing, it may be wisdom, and so on. There's 108 different options. So we're at least. So we try to cover the range of human experience.
So we find that people relate a lot to metaphors. So one metaphor I've kind of come up with that I think is useful is consider an old English house. Now, in North America, we love watching old English dramas like Downton Abbey and etc.
Upstairs, downstairs.
Upstairs, whatever. And so imagine you have this old English house. The plumbing doesn't work and the wiring's a bit odd and the floors don't meet. So with Tantra, what you're doing is you're simply rebuilding the house. You're going down into the foundations and making different choices. You're substituting a different construction in your building, right? And that's going to interfere with your day-to-day life as you build it. It's going to cause changes in how you function in your house during the day. But through the process of renovation or refurbishing this place, you're going to get a much more functional, solid, working building.
You're saying like you're modernizing the plumbing and you're sort of strengthening the timbers and that kind
rebuilding
of thing?
Your house.
Okay.
So it's a bit like a hermit crab. You're moving out of your traditional like body and mind and emotions, and you're creating this new body and this new and literally it changes your physical body. Changes your emotional body and changes your mental body. You're creating this new building that you're going to move into, right? And it's easy to forget if you're doing renovations that you were supposed to have done it last year. Any guys know this one? You're going to fix something, 2 years later you're still fixing it, never got around to it. In Canada they say don't move into a new house until you're finished because you'll never finish it if you move into it. So
is that unique to guys?
I don't know. Is that a guy thing? No, it could be in the kitchen too. You're going to redo the kitchen, move the pots around. I'm going to redo the shelves, whatever. Not to put gender, kitchen, and building, but you get the idea. So this process of reconstruction or rebuilding is very Tantra. Now the thing with Tantra is that it also, in the process of rebuilding the structure, you're also facing your 4 deepest fears. Because the nature of change to the ego is unsettling. So as soon as you unsettle the ego, you're going to bring the 4 deepest fears of your being are going to surface. Right? And you think, oh, meditation is causing these fears to arise. That's not true. Meditation is showing the rot in the foundation that we're rebuilding to remove or to eliminate these 4 deep fears. So we think it's useful for you to know what these 4 deep fears are before you start, so that when you meet the rats in the cellar, you don't freak out. I'm yelling, I'm sorry if I'm yelling to the front row, but I'm trying to help the people at the back.
Okay, so these fears are universal and human, and they might sound kind of serious, but they're really garden variety kind of fears. So first one is fear of going insane, right? I'm not sure I want to know what's going on in my mind. It might be scary. Sometimes. It will definitely be scary sometimes. Like, whoa, that's me? Really? I didn't think I was that person.
I was on the golf course some years ago with a young Korean guy, and he said, well, what do you do? I said, I teach meditation. And he said, what's meditation? I said, well, you learn what's at the bottom of your mind. And he says, I don't want to know what's at the bottom of my mind.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Yeah, meditation is definitely, it's opening the can of worms, because we are going to put the worms in the compost where they do a lot of good, right? Because worms don't belong in a can, right? Okay, so fear of going insane. Fear of being evil. So another way of putting this is fear of being a bad person, right?
There's a huge thing in human beings that if I were to unleash my energy, I would do something terrible, because I'm mad at the government, I'm mad at the healthcare, I'm mad at the public planning, I'm mad at my husband, I'm mad at my wife, I'm mad at Europe, I'm mad at Brexit, I'm mad at not Brexit, I'm mad at Americans. Yeah, we all are. So it's kind of mad at everything.
Even Americans are mad at Americans.
Even Americans are mad at Americans. So this idea that if I change the karma and I change the force of this energy, and I let this energy that's in my being loose, it would do something destructive. But it isn't the releasing of energy that Tantra accomplishes that causes you to do destructive acts. It's the repression of the energy and the habitual that gets frustrated that triggers the negative act. So if you let the energy move, the cause or the trigger to negative acts disappears. Because nobody hurts anybody when they're in a loving space. I think that's kind of unarguable. If I'm in a loving state, or if you're in a loving state, there's no motivation to hurt anyone. So it's the hurt person who does the damage. And so the fear is that if I let the energy loose, the hurt in me is going to come out. When in fact, if you release the energy, the love in me comes out. It's the hurt energy that does the negative action. What's the third one?
Third one is fear of abandonment.
Ooh, ow. Ouch.
Right, if people know what I'm really like, they won't want to be my friend.
Fear of abandonment is huge, because every single human being has been abandoned. Right? They were abandoned by their mother when they were 2, in the sense that it's about 2 years of age that our ego develops. And as our ego develops, one of the unintended consequences of it is that we realize we're separate people. And no matter what we want to do about that, we're never going to get back to mom and baby being one, right? We are now on our own. And that fear of being on our own, that fear of abandonment, right, causes us to run to habitual actions and tribal thinking in order to stay part of the collective and the group so we don't feel alone. But that collective thinking isn't necessarily always a good thing, is it? So the force of karma says, I'm going to choose loving kindness. Now imagine if everybody on the planet just said, okay, I'm not going to worry about being abandoned, I'm just going to love everybody. What do you think? Better deal? What's the fourth one?
Yeah, what is the fourth one?
Annihilation.
And fear of annihilation. Oh, if I'm kind to everybody, they'll just walk all over me. And I'll be trampled into Piccadilly Circus. Right? Be just a grease spot on the tarmac.
Walking here from the hotel, the fear of annihilation is pretty...
Came up a few times.
It's it's like...
We forget to look.
Does anybody see
Right.
anybody in this maze, right? All right. So
But part of the reason we bring up these fears is to normalize them. Like everybody has these fears somewhere. And so when they come up, we can just say like, oh, there is that fear. We do all have them, rather than believing that it's true, because it's not true. There's no reason to think that, all my friends are going to abandon me, or no one's going to like me, or no particular reason. Something like meditation or spiritual practices will make me go insane.
So as we learn to incorporate these archetypes, we're going to run into different chakras. Everybody, I assume, knows about chakras, more or less.
Where's the chakra section?
There's a chakra section here somewhere. It's on the other side. So we talk about 7 chakras, but just very briefly tonight, the 3 lower chakras are about the fears that we just talked about. So the root chakra, the sexual chakra, and the hara, 4 fingers below the belly button, right? These 3 lower chakras are the home of those 4 fears, right? So when we run into fears of annihilation or insanity, abandonment, so on, they're triggering our instinctual chakras. In order to move to
About survival and
yeah.
relationships.
In order to move to the heart chakra from the navel chakra, it's kind of like, in the old days you have cars and you could get white walls on them. Is anybody...
White wall tires.
White wall tires. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Not old enough? Yeah, one guy in the back there. Thanks. Well, it's like the standard model. It's like your iPod.
Nowadays it's like a navigation system.
Navigation or something.
Right.
So the 3 lower chakras you get for free. You're born with them as a human. The heart chakra, the throat chakra, and the 2 top chakras in the brain are also there, but they're kind of in a sense idle. They're
Neutral.
They haven't been programmed.
They
haven't been punched in.
We need to develop into those.
They haven't been triggered.
Grow into those.
So by liberating the energy in the 3 lower chakras, what you do is you need to make a decision to go to the heart chakra, and that's the difference between karma that you're just born with, the lower 3 chakras, and the karma that you choose in the heart chakra, and that's the will.
Will.
Yeah.
That's choosing what we're gonna weave.
And this brings us back to the technology of Tantra, or the methodology of Tantra. I am choosing what state I'm going to be in. I am choosing how I'm going to feel about this situation. I am choosing my responses. I am choosing how I think and orientate towards life's problems rather than just knee-jerking. And that 4th chakra, that heart chakra, is the opening of compassion. The next chakra up is the throat chakra, and that opens communication. So you can't really have decent communication with people if you're working from the 3 lower chakras, because the 3 lower chakras have these fears behind them. So to get decent communication, you got to open the heart, right?
And that's a tremendous act of generosity, communicating, right? Because it's about giving and receiving, listening to people, and then actually sharing what we're feeling or thinking.
When you open the throat chakra and the heart chakra and the throat chakra, you open the loving kindness, you open the communication, the generosity of communication, then your brain can turn on. Your thinking function and your intuitive function work better. They start to get energized by those decisions. And so what happens is your intuition about making right decisions, your decision-making process, how you think about things changes from mere tribal conditioning to where we're headed, which is planetary conditioning. So there's a new day coming, and it's called planetary consciousness, right? But to get to planetary consciousness, we got to get past tribal consciousness. So all of this kind of stuff that's going on now, right, in the world from America to England and everywhere else, is still really rooted in tribal. We have to start thinking planetary. which includes other species.
Oh yeah.
This is a tantric decision.
And it's pretty clear that we need to do this, right? It's going to take the entire planet to resolve the big issues like climate change, right? It's going to take everybody, and it's going to take everybody working together. Maybe we should go ahead.
Yeah, just 2 more points. So, 1, what do you want to choose? It's your choice. You get to choose everything from here on forward, right? Choose it. But now you've got to live it. And to live it, you need a technology or methodology that you can apply, that you do over and over and over again until the old structure crumbles
That's why we
as
call
the
it,
new structure emerges.
that's why we call it practice.
Yeah.
We do it over and over and over until it's a habit.
Now, the last point I think that we want to make is that it also transforms the gender issues. So as you meditate on being a female deity if you're male, or you meditate on being a male deity, tantric archetype if you're female, then you start to see what the experience is like from the other position. So a lot of gender issues fall out as you meditate on male deities if you're female, or female deities if you're male, because you try to become them. So then you get a sense of the gender issues are arbitrary, not fundamental. Anything else?
And that's Tantra.
And that's Tantra in a nutshell. 2,000 years and 20 minutes. So as Tantra relate to surrender? And the short answer is yes. Because the ego is in a defensive position. The ego by definition is defensive. It's protecting itself from the 4 fears, but it's also protecting itself from hurt and pain and etc. So in our protection, the protection against the hurt is the hurt. We thought, oh, we were hurt over there, but not anymore. Now our protection is the very nature of the hurt. So in order to open to tantric realization, you need to let go of the hurt. And when the hurt is let go of, you'll go through some shock waves as it, like muscle tension if you go to masseuse, It's going to hurt a little bit letting go, but when it lets go, you feel great. So short answer, you betcha. The purpose of mantra in establishing the link with the deity? Yeah. Right.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Well, there's a number of different functions. One, like Doug Sensei alluded to earlier, tantric practice is very smart and very practical in that it occupies all of our senses. As the saying goes, idle hands are the devil's workshop. Well, so are idle minds and idle ears and idle eyes. So the practice, we visualize, we say the mantra to occupy our speech. We use the beads to occupy our hands. We visualize with our minds and our eyes, and then we say the mantra to occupy our speaking in our ears. And in addition to that, so we're occupying all of our senses, having a full sensory experience. It's kind of like an IMAX theater, like you're creating your own IMAX theater with that practice. And then in addition to that, then the seed syllables, as I'm sure you know, are ancient and do have some power to release hormones in the body. So they're activating our glands to function more healthfully in a way that our contemporary conditioning, societal conditioning doesn't really include that.
Yeah, and insofar as our emotions ride on our speech, like if the gentleman behind you bothers you, your mind tends to go, well, Joe is, like this, or Joe's like that. So the habitual reaction to hurt, the speech can carry the emotion. So if you've got a mantra going, right, if you have a mantra going, it's harder for that voice to come in. You go, okay, compassion for Joe, or kindness for Joe, or Joe, intelligence for Joe, or whatever mantra you're using, then that habitual mind has a harder time finding the groove. The other principle of Tantra is tuning fork. So if I want to be in tune with the Dalai Lama, or if I want to be in tune with Donald Trump, that's a decision, right? So I'm going to choose to be in tune with the Dalai Lama, so that mantra is also a vibrational energy between beings. like love, 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 or kind of suspicion, 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 suspicion. So that mantra has the ability to do that. Okay.
Yes. How does the practice
So
engage the mind is the question.
How does the, yes. So the nature of insight and the nature of samatha are different. So with samatha practice, which is mantra and visualization, you're occupying the mind with a substitute. In contemplation, you're allowing the mind to go
with
into
an object.
With an object. In insight or vipassana or Zen meditation, stuff like that, you're more in a contemplation mode. You're not really using mantra or visualization in this case. You're opening the mind to give you some insight or feed. But we want the insight mind to ride on the foundation of the samatha mind. So by calming the body and calming the mind with the mantra and the visualization, we're in a good space, right? We're in a kusala, we're in a good room. Then from the good room space...
It's calm and it's pleasant.
Yes. And from the good room space, then we can ask an interesting question. Like, what should I go back to university or shouldn't I? But we're not running from panic now, we're running from calm and clarity. So you can use contemplation to ask questions and investigations, but it's riding on a good space, a clear space, rather than a worried or a upset space. So the samatha practice builds the foundation, and then the insight practice is the contemplation. So in that sense, half the yoga is a...
Time.
Yes. Half the yoga is a settling foundation physically. Mantra and visualization is emotionally settling. And then contemplation is investigation. All right.
When we catch ourselves thinking negative thoughts, how can we train ourselves to change that without being too hard on ourselves? Sort of being there for ourselves.
Yeah, without abandoning or rejecting ourselves.
Without abandoning or rejecting ourselves in the moment. Yeah, that's a good question. There's a concept known as the good enough mother that for whatever reason in our contemporary society we usually never feel like we had. Nothing against mothers. All mothers try their best and love their children. But a big part of the practice is to become our own good enough mother. And while on the one hand our practice is all about learning to not be self-centered, not make this story all about me, at the same time I can only love others as much as I love myself. So the practice is really going in every direction. It's loving kindness and compassion towards oneself so that we can have loving kindness and compassion for others, and vice versa.
May I add?
Please.
Yeah. So from the point of view of the awakened ones, the thoughts and feelings and sensations that occupy our mind are like clothing, like a shirt or a t-shirt and so on. So by throwing off the clothes, the shirt, the t-shirt, and so on, you're not abandoning the core of your being, which is naked. So from the point of view of Dharma, the core of your being is naked. It isn't the thoughts, it isn't the feelings, and it isn't the sensations that are arising in your day. Those are clothes. So changing your clothes from a toga to a yoga, from a robe to a pair of pants, doesn't imply abandoning yourself in any way. What it does imply is that I get to choose what my thoughts and feelings and sensations are, as much as just taking what arises naturally, but is conditioned by everything else. They're also put on you. So you get the freedom to decide what clothes you're going to put on and what feelings you're going to put on. But what the world sees are all these clothes that are being worn. But in essence, we're all the same naked mind, capital M, right? And so in that sense, you haven't abandoned yourself. You've abandoned the things you've associated and identified with yourself because you thought your shirt was who you were.
This is where that awareness, compassion, wisdom, strength,
abundance, and joy. We've added a few more as we've gone along. My teacher, Namjo Rinpoche, and Catherine's teacher, would do awareness, compassion, wisdom. That was in the 70s. In the 80s, we added strength. In the 90s, we're adding abundance, and in the 2000 and where are we? 10, 20s? It's like joy. So, just a quick word on the generosity thing. The idea of generosity from the point of view of the Buddhist order is that by giving people the opportunity to give, they were gathering merit. And I think the easiest way to wrap your head around this one is to think that the parent gives and the child receives. So insofar as you're in a giving position, you're taking on the responsibility of the adult position. And in the receiving, in a sense, you take on the child role that someone's going to take care of you. So by giving people the opportunity to give, we're actually promoting the adult or the maturity of the strength of your being, rather than more the child role of the receiving. So that's another way of looking at Dana.
Yeah, developing strength and generating merit. Something we're always doing. Two things we're always doing.